All right, so did this all in the wrong order. Not helpful. Okay. All right, here we go. So we talked about anatomy of both the male and female reproductive system. And so now we just have to talk about basically the mechanisms by which the female reproductive system works as far as delivering eggs for potential fertilization. Because we talked about how the male system does that for sperm. So now we're gonna look at the other side of it. And the reason why we couldn't just finish it up last time is because this is a lot more complicated than sperm production and hormones on the male side. So when we look at the reproductive physiology in women, everything works in cycles. So the reproductive cycle is defined as everything from fertilization of an egg to the birth of a baby to return to fertility. So the reproductive cycle covers literally reproduction. But in order to get to fertilization of an egg, women have to go through a sexual cycle. And a sexual cycle is a combination of the cyclic changes that take place in the ovary, the cyclic changes that take place in the uterus, and the hormones or the hormone cycles that link all of it together. So we'll mostly focus on the ovary because that's driving the majority of this sexual cycle, but we'll also be touching on changes occurring in the uterus as well as some hormonal feedback loops. All right, so this cycle has an average length of 28 days, which means that on average, women will go through this whole cycle in 28 days, but it's actually quite variable. So the range of this cycle can be somewhere between 21 and 40 days, depending on the individual woman and the individual cycle. So some women have a very consistent cycle, it's the exact same length every single time. Some women have a more variably length cycle. So anything within that is normal. Now, just like testicular hormones and testosterone, sorry, are regulated through the hypothalamic pituitary testicular, I don't know why I'm having trouble with that word today, axis. So in women, we have a gonadal axis as well. So the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis is regulating this cycle. And it's regulating it by acting on the ovaries in a very similar way that the testes were acted upon. Okay, so we'll go through how that works in a minute. So we're going to split this up into these two different cycles, although they are related to each other. And then we'll kind of look at them, how they all work together. So the ovarian cycle is defined as the cyclic events that result in ovulation of a mature egg. And the uterine cycle is the changes that cyclically occur to the endometrial lining of the uterus to prepare it to potentially receive a fertilized egg and support the beginning of a pregnancy. So when we look at the ovarian cycle, we can split it into two phases. The first one is called the follicular phase. I cannot remember if I told you this, but in the ovary, the eggs are in those follicles of cells. And so the follicular phase is all about development of follicles to eventually ovulate a single mature egg. So the follicular phase usually takes about 2 weeks, although it is variable. And the ending of the follicular phase is ovulation. So we're preparing an egg and we ovulate it. So then obviously we're going to be done with that phase because we accomplished the goal. That takes us to the second phase, which is called the luteal phase. It's called the luteal phase because when a follicle ovulates an egg, the follicle itself stays functional and it transforms into something called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to continue to produce hormones. And so we name this part of the phase, this part of the cycle after the hormone producing thing in the ovary. The corpus luteum is temporary. We'll talk about it more in a second. And it does go away. It actually breaks down if a pregnancy doesn't occur. And that corresponds to the loss of the endometrium, which we'll get to. Some of these I kind of put in extra things, and when you go back and review it, then it'll help you tie in all the information together. Okay, so let's look at the follicular phase in detail. If you're not familiar with the cycle, we haven't talked about the uterus yet, but the uterine cycle ends with menstruation, which is shedding of the lining, the endometrial lining. So it sounds kind of weird to talk about the follicular phase starting at the beginning of menstruation because that's a different cycle, but that's the easiest way to be aware of it. But basically, every single time we lose a corpus luteum, the ovary starts over again in a follicular phase. And that corresponds to the beginning of menstruation because that's when we're shedding that lining. So we also call this a pre-ovulatory phase because it's the part that takes place before ovulation. And it is mostly driven by FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone. This is the actual physiological event that we named this hormone after. So secreted by the anterior pituitary, because the hypothalamus is going to secrete GnRH. So FSH is going to act on the ovary to stimulate the growth and maturation of multiple eggs. So we get a bunch of different follicles stimulated. The group of them is called a cohort. That's where that comes from. And the supporting cells that surround the egg are going to start secreting estrogens. So FSH basically stimulates the maturation of an egg for potential ovulation and estrogen secretion. Now, estrogen has a negative feedback effect. It inhibits the secretion of GnRH and FSH. It's not going to really block luteinizing hormone secretion. And so that is still going to rise. So we actually split this into two phases because of the effects of FSH and estrogen. At the beginning, hold on, I'm saying this wrong. Sorry, let me try this again. Follicles. So follicles actually develop over a long period of time. And so there's two parts to follicular development, which actually can start up to a year before a possible ovulation. So the preantral phase is how we get follicles to develop until they're ready to enter the follicular cycle, or the ovarian cycle, the follicular phase. So what happens is that local hormones, so they're called paracrines, stimulate development of the eggs, the oocytes, and then their surrounding cells, so the follicle itself. This is going to go on for months. And once they get to a certain point, then when we have FSH secretion at the beginning of a follicular phase, then they're going to enter this antral phase, which is where follicles that have receptors for FSH are going to rapidly develop over the course of about 2 weeks. As they develop, they secrete estrogen. Estrogen feeds back and inhibits the release of FSH. And that leads to the selection of a dominant follicle. So we have a whole group of follicles developing, but only one of them usually is going to ovulate. And the way that that's figured out is whichever follicle keeps developing, even as we have decreasing levels of FSH, is the one that's going to be able to mature. The rest of them stop maturing because now there's no more FSH stimulating them. But the dominant follicle doesn't need the FSH anymore. The dominant follicle just keeps making estrogen and keeps maturing. So this is a diagram kind of showing that. So what we have is, in order to get us to this primordial follicle phase where we have receptors for FSH, we have that preantral development that happens locally. And then once they have FSH receptors, then we enter that antral phase. And so this is just showing you how we mature. What happens is that the follicular cells multiply. And so we get a lot more follicular cells, and they're all producing estrogen. And meanwhile, that oocyte is preparing itself so that if it's the one that gets ovulated, it can be ready to be fertilized. So whatever follicle becomes dominant and is able to keep maturing, even though FSH secretion has now been inhibited, forms into this guy. It's called a tertiary follicle. And so the egg and a single layer of cells end up in the middle of this little pool of fluid. It's called follicular fluid because it's produced by the follicle. And then the rest of the cells stay on the outside. And this kind of grows like a pimple almost, so that when the right signal comes along, which we'll get to next, for ovulation, that egg and its little layer of cells literally gets popped out with that fluid. And then the rest of the cells stay behind, and they transform into that corpus luteum. Okay, so let's see how that ovulation occurs. Because the LH is not inhibited, it actually keeps going. So we have an LH surge where basically the amount of luteinizing hormone being released from the pituitary keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. And that increase triggers the ovulation from the dominant follicle. So now we have an egg released, okay, an oocyte, don't worry about this. And then the layer of follicular cells surrounding it is called the corona radiata. It's a little, we're seeing a lot of this imagery right now for completely different reasons, but it looks like a crown radiating around the egg, okay? Oh, and don't worry about that. I don't know why I forgot to take that out. Okay, so basically it's because of that follicular fluid, it builds up and bursts the egg out of the ovary. Hopefully the uterine tube catches the oocyte, because remember, there's no direct connection. So those fimbriae have to like grab it. And this next slide is an actual picture of it happening. So this was, somebody was having like arthroscopic surgery, and they actually captured an ovulation in the process of happening, which is pretty crazy. So this is an ovary, and this is a dominant follicle, and this is the follicular fluid with the oocyte inside of it. It's kind of crazy. Okay, so it kind of really does look like that. Anyway, so ovulation. Ovulation switches us from the follicular phase to the luteal phase, which obviously is also called the post-ovulatory phase, because ovulation marks the changeover. And this lasts from the time of ovulation until the onset of the next menstruation, which again is kind of a weird marker because it's nothing to do with the ovary, but it's because of the link between the uterus and the follicles. So the follicle actually bleeds into the antrum, which is the space where the fluid used to be. Don't worry about that. And the cells that are left over in the follicle actually keep multiplying. So there's a lot of mitosis. They completely fill in that space, and that entire remaining follicle turns into this corpus luteum. And this is because luteinizing hormone continues to be secreted, and it stimulates this transformation. So now, instead of making estrogen, all of these cells start to secrete mostly progesterone. Nope, go back. So there is still some estrogen, but really it's about progesterone, and we call it a CL. Now, corpus luteum means yellow body, because if you look at an ovary with a CL on it, it is kind of yellowy. And so we named the phase and the hormone, all of it just means yellow, which is really weird when you think about it, but just ignore that part, okay? If a pregnancy does not occur, that CL disappears. The technical term is involution. It takes 14 days for that to happen. So basically you form a corpus luteum after ovulation, and a timer kicks in for 14 days. After 14 days, either a pregnancy has to be taking place to maintain the status quo, or the timer goes off, the corpus luteum disappears, and so do all of these hormones. And then the place where the CL was scars down into a little scar in the ovary, and they call it the corpus albicans, which means the white body, because the scar is, you know, mostly fibrous connective tissue, and it looks white. Such weird things we use. Okay, so before we talk about what's happening in the uterus, let's make sure we're clear on all these hormones. So the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis is obviously a bit more complicated than the one in males because of this cycle. But we're still using the same hormones. So we're still having that GnRH release from the hypothalamus, releasing FSH and LH. And sometimes we're getting estrogen release, and sometimes we're getting progesterone release. And they're going to have both negative and positive feedback control over the release of these hypothalamic and pituitary hormones. So if we look here, during the follicular phase, we're getting that GnRH release, LH and FSH acting on the follicles. Estrogens are going to negatively feed back. And it's also going to act on the uterus to cause thickening of the endometrium, which we'll talk about. Now, here's the part that I kind of oversimplified before. We are technically inhibiting all hormone release here. So you're like, well, how do we get that LH surge, right? Okay, so the LH surge happens because that dominant follicle keeps producing estrogen even though it's no longer getting stimulated by FSH. And when estrogen levels get high enough, we actually have a positive feedback loop, one of the very rare positive feedback loops. And so at high levels, we actually increase secretion of GnRH, and that causes a surge in LH and FSH. And the LH part is going to trigger ovulation. So voila, we get ovulation. Then we get to the luteal phase, and now we're mostly making progesterone from the corpus luteum instead of estrogen from a follicle. Progesterone also has a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So now we are again inhibiting the release of these guys, and we are also, which I'll repeat in just a second, encouraging stuff in the endometrium. And at that 14-day point, when that timer goes off and the corpus luteum goes away, now we shed that lining and we turn off this inhibition, and so that takes us back to the beginning of this follicular phase, and we go through it again. This is the other way that we look at this. So we typically do ovarian anatomy with follicles in every single stage. So I'm not going to go through it right now because we just talked about it, but just want to point out that everything is on here. And so the follicular phase is up here, ovulation is here, and the luteal phase is down here. Okay, so the uterus is being controlled by the hormones secreted by the ovaries. And we split up the uterine cycle into 3 phases. I don't know why there's 3, but I mean, I know why there's 3, I'm about to tell you, but it's just annoying to me because there's 2 phases for the ovarian. Anyway, getting distracted. So the menstrual phase is when we shed the built-up layer of the endometrium. And it's also when the follicular phase starts. So that's why we're starting here, because we started with the follicular phase for the ovarian cycle. So we're going through this in the same timing as we just went through. Okay, so the follicular phase is going to continue as the menstrual phase ends. So once the old endometrium is shed, now a new one is going to get built up because we have estrogen being secreted by follicles. So we call this the proliferative phase. It's also the pre-ovulatory phase. So see how that joins up with calling the follicular phase the pre-ovulatory phase? So now we're joining the uterine and ovarian cycles. So estrogen encourages thickening of the endometrium. There are glands in here in the same way that there are glands in the digestive system. So we're getting like this kind of layering of the endometrium, and the epithelial cells here are going to be secreting stuff. We get enlargement of arteries to support that thickened epithelium, and the proliferative phase ends when ovulation occurs. So then we finish off with a phase under the influence of progesterone. We call it the secretory or post-ovulatory phase. So the secretory phase is meant to prepare the uterus for an embryo implantation, because after ovulation, we can potentially have a pregnancy. So now instead of thickening this, we're going to take this thickened endometrium and we're going to actually secrete from the endometrial glands. And it doesn't matter. Anyway, so we're secreting some stuff. It's meant to provide nutrition for a potential embryo. And then this completely lines up with the luteal phase. So it's 14 days. And at the end of it, if a pregnancy hasn't occurred, then the CL is going to go away, right? And so without that progesterone, we go back to the menstrual phase. We shed the lining and we start over again. Okay, so here we can line it all up. Here are our pituitary hormones, FSH and LH. Here are our ovarian hormones, and here is what's happening to the uterus. So when we start here, FSH and LH levels are going to stimulate the follicular phase. So we get increasing levels of estrogen. You can see as the estrogen levels go up, these guys go back down a little bit, but then this peaks, and that switches us from a negative to a positive feedback loop, especially for an LH surge. That LH surge triggers ovulation. So now estrogen levels drop, progesterone levels go up, and then they all drop as we make the CL go away. So under the influence of estrogen, we are thickening the endometrium in this proliferative phase. And then we're pretty thick here, but now we're secreting from these glands. And then the whole thing gets shed in menstruation, and we start again. Okay, you just go round and round and round. This is the way it looks in your book. It's all of this stuff together. So this is showing you the follicular phase, selecting a dominant follicle, and how the ovarian cycle lines up with the uterine cycle. So strongly recommend making sure you totally understand what's going on in this diagram, because it's pretty much all of the physiology in one thing. Okay, so let's look at what else these hormones do, because we've looked at it from the cycle, but we haven't really looked at it in general. So this is basically just the same thing as we looked at all the stuff that testosterone does. Now we're looking at all the stuff estrogen does. So not only does estrogen promote oogenesis, so egg formation and follicle growth, it also has anabolic effects on the female reproductive tract. So the presence of estrogen keeps the ovaries, the oviducts, the uterus, the vagina, the external genitalia, all of it ready for sex and pregnancy, and some influences on the breast as well. It causes a growth spurt at puberty, and then it encourages the closure of your growth plates. It's responsible for female secondary sexual characteristics, including breast development, increased fat deposition in subcutaneous places, especially in specific places like the hips and the breast, the widening and lightening of the pelvis so that it's better shaped for childbirth. Estrogen also helps maintain lower cholesterol levels than it does without it, and maintains bone density through calcium uptake. These two are the reason why after menopause, when women stop cycling and stop ovulating, why they're at increased risk of heart problems, so that they can get high cholesterol. It can predispose them to heart attacks and other heart problems, and also why they're prone to osteoporosis, because the estrogen was preventing those things, and then it gets withdrawn, and then you're having potential problems. And the lack of anabolic effects can also cause uncomfortable issues with the reproductive system as well. Progesterone's effects obviously work in synergy with estrogen for the uterine cycle. Obviously, major effects on uterus. So promotes uterine secretions during the secretory phase. Also promotes thickening of cervical mucus. And then most of progesterone's most important effects are during pregnancy, which we will not actually be discussing later because we don't have time for that. It's in your book if you're curious. And hopefully you'll get to learn about it some other time. Usually I cover it, but that's because I have 2 semesters. But anyway, progesterone is the most important hormone in pregnancy. Ooh, sorry. All right, so female sexual response is fairly equivalent to the male sexual response, and that it also occurs in 2 phases. The first one is arousal, which is the female equivalent to erection, in that the parasympathetic nervous system is mediating it, and it's mostly about vasodilation, increasing blood flow to relevant areas. Now, in this case, we see blood flow increasing to the clitoris, which makes sense because it's comparable to the penis. We also see increased blood flow to the vaginal mucosa, the bulbs of the vestibule, as well as, for reasons I don't think anyone understands, to the breasts. So all of those will have increased blood flow. We'll also see increased secretion from the vestibular glands. So the greater vestibular glands I told you about, as well as the other ones are also called the lesser, or the periurethral glands, and the vaginal wall secretions, which is aided by that increased blood flow. And that is lubricating the vestibule and the vagina, The vestibule is like the opening into the vagina, which I didn't really point out, but it's kind of the last or deepest part of the external genitalia. The second phase is orgasm, but here we have some differences between male orgasm and female orgasm. We're not going to go into all the details, but basically, you know, the biggest difference here is that it's not accompanied by ejaculation, right? Because you're not sending anything out, you're just receiving if it's for reproductive purposes. This is not required for conception. So it's very different in that we don't necessarily know for sure why it happens, but we do know that it is generally pleasurable. We know that there are a lot of different ways that women can orgasm, but the one that we have like a physiological understanding of is that we see rhythmic contractions of the smooth muscle of the uterus, along with increased skeletal muscle tension, increase in heart rate, and increase in blood pressure. So again, you know, kind of like the clitoris is very sensitive, has a lot of nerve endings, because it's got all the same stuff as the penis, but the penis is, you know, necessary for ejaculation and actual reproductive purposes, whereas the clitoris doesn't do that. So female orgasm is kind of like that. Doesn't mean it's not important, but from a purely reproductive standpoint, it is not actually necessary. Okay, so female sexual response, similar but very different to the male sexual response. Sorry. I couldn't find any good diagrams. This was the closest thing I could find. I know it's not very useful, but basically what it's talking about is the fact that female sexual responses can be very complicated, and it's not always easy for women to become aroused. It's usually fairly easy for men to become aroused. It's about the way they're wired. So there's a lot more to it than that. Again, they teach entire classes about this. We don't have time for it. If you are curious about this, there are some good books out there that I do recommend. This is not a useful reference for that because it's very clinical, but they're out there. Okay, so the mammary gland is kind of weird because it is part of the female reproductive system, but it's not directly related to the female reproductive system. It's in a completely different location, and it really only has a function after childbirth, right? So I really don't go into it beyond this because I only cover it when I cover pregnancy and stuff that happens after birth, and like I said, we don't have time for that. So the mammary glands are within the breast, whereas the breast is defined as the mounds of tissue overlying the pectoralis major muscle, so on the thorax. Oh my God, are you kidding me? Dog is itchy. Jesus Christ. Okay, sorry. The mammary gland is within the breast. Now, mammary glands are only fully developed and functional during lactation. They become fully functional by the end of a pregnancy, and then they produce milk for as long as they're being stimulated after a pregnancy. Once nursing is stopped, they actually atrophy back to their underdeveloped form, because why waste all the energy if you're not using them? Interestingly, they're actually highly modified sweat glands, which is super weird. And from an anatomical standpoint, there are actually two regions to them. So there's the body, which is what we typically think of as where the mammary gland is within the breast. And then there's an axillary tail where it kind of tapers off towards the armpits. And then the body of the gland has an apex, has a nipple at the apex surrounded by an areola, which is typically more pigmented. And thinner, more sensitive skin, which makes sense because that's where the infant would be nursing. Diagram, okay? So it's highly modified from its sweat gland origins. And basically we have a bunch of different lobes, or, well, we call them lobules, containing secretory exocrine tissue. And then there's a lot of adipose tissue surrounding that, supporting that, and potentially providing it with readily available nutrition, although we don't really know, to be honest, why there's so much fat in breast tissue, because nobody else does it except people. Anyway, the breast itself is supported by some suspensory ligaments, so there's some dense connective tissue providing structural support. And then what you can see over here is that each of the lobules actually has an individual duct. And so at the nipple, there's actually a bunch of small openings for milk flow, rather than like there being like one big one, which may not sound like anything to you, but if you've ever like milked a cow, if you're used to how cows or goats or something lactate, then this is a very different setup. If you don't, then you have no expectations and it's not a surprise. Okay, so anyway, oh, and this doesn't really show you the axillary tail, but it just kind of goes like that. Okay, so mammary gland within the breast. The nipple is usually in the center, surrounded by the areola, and you can see the internal anatomy is a bunch of highly organized tissue. Here's a variety of resources about things you probably don't need to know about. I would just skip this one. This one might be more interesting. It's stuff about the female sexual response and the male sexual response. So if you wanted to do some reading that was about not current events, these might be interesting. We know a lot about it, but there are also a lot of myths associated with human sexual responses. So if that's something you've always wanted to know more about, or that you have any issues with or anything like that, you might find this useful. Or you can just skip them entirely, because for the purposes of this course, you only need to know what's in the PowerPoint. I think that's all I got. That's all I got. Does anybody have any questions? This, all those red lines go away. Stop sharing. Okay, so that is the end of our new material. We have now covered every system in the body, as well as some preparatory stuff before that. And that's essentially anatomy and physiology in one semester. So at this point, you have one more exam covering new material. So that's going to be this weekend, Friday, Saturday, covering the digestive system, the urinary system, and the reproductive system. Next week, you're going to have a cumulative final exam, and we will have a review session Monday for that, which is not technically when we're scheduled to have class, but I figured we're online and it's being recorded anyway, so that's fine. Let's see, so you have some worksheets for the new systems, and we can talk more about the final exam next week, and I'll send out an announcement before that so that you can study this weekend before that. But does anyone have questions right now? Anybody else? All right, so you can certainly email me if you have questions. I will send out some announcements, just reinforcing the details of the last few things that we have for the course. And If you're able to make it to a review session next Monday, then I will see you then. And if not, good luck with your exams.